Welcome to Wednesday, everybody. Today is the third day in social psychology, and today actually carries with it a couple of real classics, things that you may have already heard of, but now you get some background on, and things that you will almost certainly hear about again. Okay, these areas of social psych that we're going to end up with in this chapter are super fun. Because they're just fun on their own. They're intriguing. The studies themselves are actually quite famous and kind of dark in a lot of ways, and dangerous. And for me, it's nice because it kind of gets my blood boiling a little bit, because these are some of the areas that I'm most familiar with when it comes to the evolutionary approach. And this is where a lot of tension and a lot of friction comes in between the way that psychologists have traditionally been addressing these questions and how the evolutionary psychologists have come in to try to rework our thinking on these topics. So when we get there, I'll point it out. Don't worry, I'm not going to miss it. But let's go ahead and get started. The next topic that was in the chapter after we closed off on Monday was the idea of relationships, love, liking, and attraction. Attraction is something that people like to think is mysterious, but it actually follows a fairly predictable pattern. A lot of variance in attraction can be explained by some pretty reliable factors. One of them is that we like people who are familiar. That is, people who we see on a regular basis, people who we're exposed to a lot, and people who are geographically near. This has led to the observance of what we call the near exposure effect. With no other information, with no positive interactions or any other factors, simply being exposed to the presence of another person repeatedly again and again makes one person feel like they might like that person more. Okay, that makes them seem more attractive, makes them seem more likable. And this actually makes a lot of sense in the context of what we learned on Monday about the self-reflective model of attitude, which is, if you're seeing somebody again and again and again and again, there's a chance that the reason you're seeing them again and again is because you enjoy seeing them, and you're putting yourself in a position to see them again and again. So if you want to explain your past behavior, then the one good explanation for your past behavior of having seen that person so many times is that you are making it happen because you like them. Another thing that we actually observe when it comes to knowing who people are attracted to is that people tend to be attracted to people who are similar to them. The old adage that opposites attract is simply false. If you are a person who is conservative, you will like another person who is conservative. If you are a person who is introverted, you will like another person who is introverted. Basically, every factor that we've been able to study, with the possible exception of dominance and submission, you tend to be attracted to, like, want to be friends with people who share similarities with you. People match up. The other thing that, of course, makes a big difference in who we like is the idea of attractiveness. Attractiveness is kind of a touchy thing to study. Nobody really wants to make bold, sweeping claims about it. It's a very problematic concept that has problematic effects in society. But nevertheless, it's definitely a factor, and it's definitely worth studying. Beauty, physical attractiveness, is something that you may be unwilling to hear this from me, but that is universal. What does that mean? What that means is that, given that there is going to be some cultural variance, and given that there's going to be some cultural difference in a couple of traits that might be more or less attractive in some cultures, overwhelmingly, a person who is attractive in one culture is going to be recognized as attractive by people in another culture. If you ranked 50 people, hot to not, in America, and then you turn those pictures over to somebody in any other culture, they would basically be giving people the same ranking. There is a lot about beauty that kind of makes sense in terms of our biological design and the commonality of biological design that human beings have. Beauty is a shorthand, a shortcut, a cognitive encapsulation or summary or trick that tends to tell us a lot about basically the mate value of a person that we see. And it has a tendency to track those factors that correlate with mate value or fertility or mating potential. Now, we are all finding the same people the most attractive, but that doesn't mean that we all end up pursuing and being with only the most attractive people. Here we have a picture of Christina Hendricks. There is a reason why I am not with Christina Hendricks, and that is because Christina Hendricks is a 10, and I know that I am not, never will be, even with a lot of work on my jaw and plastic surgery, Brad Pitt or another 10, a Nathan Fillion, somebody else who could actually have a chance. This is what's known as the matching hypothesis. It is important to recognize how attractive people are in society, but it's also important to rate yourself relatively accurately, but you give yourself usually a couple of points in your favor just in the hopes that you can convince other people that you're more attractive than you actually are. And it saves people effort of pursuing and wasting time on people who are definitely going to reject them for any kind of mating or romantic opportunity. So people who are 10s end up with other 10s, people who are 4s and 5s tend to end up with other 4s and 5s. That is called the matching hypothesis. And it isn't as if somebody's like, man, this person sucks and I hate them, but I guess I'm a 4, so I better stick with a 4. It actually affects our mechanisms in such a way that we genuinely do find those people attractive. And part of what we find attractive about them is that given our status, they are someone with whom we have a chance, that they are attainable. This idea, by the way, as kind of solid in terms of research and on solid ground empirically, is nevertheless one of the most toxic ideas to infect the dark corners of the internet. If you find a, quote, nice guy or a red pillar out there somewhere, there is a chance that if they are really deep into this philosophy, that they'll be running around with a misinterpretation of the matching hypothesis. Knowing that they are a 3, they will be of the opinion that they somehow have the right or the entitlement to be with another 3, and that anyone who is a 9 or a 10 and is dating everybody across the attraction spectrum is an unfair or evil person who's taking what's rightfully theirs. This is an extraordinarily toxic idea. Nobody has a claim or a right to a romantic relationship with anybody else. But it's another one of those examples about how decent empirical science can be fairly easily twisted to make terrible societal or political conclusions. All right. The next thing to talk about when it comes to love, liking, and relationships is all of the different ways that two people can end up in a relationship with each other. People often say, I don't like labels. I don't want to put a label on it. It is what it is. Well, the scientist is never usually that happy with that kind of an arrangement. They want to put a label on something or want to describe something. They want to know what it's like. And so this was a set of ideas put forth by Sternberg who had the triangular theory of love. So he kind of recognized that love was not just one thing. Long-term relationships weren't one thing. Short-term relationships weren't one thing. And they varied in a lot of different ways. And by staking out 3 different dimensions that could be assembled in different combinations, that he could describe a lot of what people intuitively think of as different flavors of contact between two people. So the 3 points on this triangle are intimacy, passion, and commitment. Intimacy means that you know a lot about somebody, you have shared a lot of time, you've shared some intimate details. Commitment means that you have stated that you're in, or you've demonstrated that you're in for a long period of time. And passion is basically sexual attraction. Different combinations of these can describe different relationships that you might be familiar with. Fatuous love is one that it comes along. It's actually a lot, well, let's see. Here's an example. Storybooks really like the idea, in order to move the plot along quickly and fulfill some sort of fantasy, shipping people in a story quite quickly and getting them in a situation that should be recognized as fatuous love. Anna and Hans were a great example of fatuous love. They had a lot of passion for each other, they had a commitment to each other, but they didn't know each other clearly enough or at all. And it was one of the high points of Frozen, where Elsa came along and said, "This is insane. This is stupid. You have no intimacy at all. This is fatuous. You can't get married right away," which was a real shock because that's not how fairy books normally go. Um, Another romantic love is intimacy and passion. You are deeply into each other. You're deeply passionate with each other. You know a lot, but you don't really have any vision for what the long term is going to be. That's your Romeo and Juliet romantic love. Okay, Romeo and Juliet couldn't really figure out what the future was going to be. They didn't have one. If you've ever, spoiler alert, it's only been a few hundred years, but they both died. They didn't have a future. But it was nevertheless very intense. It was nevertheless very, very intimate. Companionate love, and I don't want to spread too many, well, shoot. I want to recognize that what I'm dealing in here is a little bit of a stereotype or a trope about elderly people, that they do not have passion or that they do not have sex. They do. They have a lot more sex than most people give them credit for, and it's actually quite good for mental and physical health. But nevertheless, one of the ways in which people typically think of a companionate love, where there's commitment and there's intimacy, but there's not a sexual tension or charge or passion, is in a marriage that has been going on for decades and decades, and the passion is kind of drained away, but there is still intimacy and there is still commitment. If you've got all three, if you know somebody very well, you're committed to them for the long term, and there's still a lot of energy, then you have consummate love, which is something that doesn't last throughout the entirety of every relationship that starts that way. That doesn't start that way for every relationship, kind of comes and goes, and is not something that is very easy to achieve. The book also has something to say a little bit about the sex differences between men and women, males and females, when it comes to love, mating, sex. It's all together there here in this chapter, but basically attraction and liking. Um, and I get the sense that they kind of felt like they had to tiptoe around it, which is probably the case. You don't want to turn off um, a large number of people who might otherwise buy your book by saying something that they don't want to hear. But I'm going to address it here anyway. The chart that is in the book has 5 different situations that you might ask somebody to hypothesize about, in terms of being in a relationship with another person. Um, and these are one night stands, so brief amount of sexual activity, dating, going on a date. That's a short term, like not necessarily an item, but you would spend some time with them. Being in a relationship that is sexual over the long term, not just one night, but in kind of an ongoing sexual relationship. Steadily dating, something where you might say that you are dating, not just talking to your friends. And then being in a long term committed legal commitment like a marriage. Those 5 different situations were what people were asked to imagine, and then they were asked to say, what is the minimum, not desirable, but the minimum amount of intelligence necessary for a partner if you were going to engage in one of these 5 situations with that partner. Now, I want to make a note here, and it has been true throughout most of the talk that has been given here. It was true in the pictures that I put up in Sternberg's Triangular Love, is that this research has almost exclusively been done and focused on and kind of assumed heterosexuality. Looking at heterosexual relationships is usually where these researchers start, and anything that is not vanilla heterosexual is kind of thought of as a fringe or other kind of special area, special topic. It's not, it shouldn't be. But we're usually here, especially when it comes to sex differences, talking about the differences between men and women, and they're probably mostly being measured in the context of heterosexual couplings. But just wanted to make a note of that. But here's the thing. The strategy that you are going to use in filtering out who you will and who you won't have a one-night stand, date, sexual relationship, steady dating, or marriage with is going to be a part of a program that is being executed by the brain that natural selection has given you. That brain is going to take a lot of information into account, not just its base programming, but it's also going to be programmed to take conditions from your culture into account. It's going to take conditions about your safety and your life and your the traditions that you're surrounded with. All sorts of stuff is going to go into that. But one of the things that's definitely going to be a concern and could drive a figure like this, could drive a data set like this, is that part of what makes you accept or reject partners for these situations is the opportunity cost. And what do I mean by opportunity cost? Opportunity cost is the idea that when you're doing or one thing or spending money on one thing, you can't be spending that money or doing another thing. So if you want to go out to dinner with your friends, you can't also go out to dinner with your girlfriend. Going out to your friends has not only a monetary cost, not only a time cost, but an opportunity cost. There are things that you cannot otherwise do. The longer you are going to be in a situation with them, the more time you're going to be giving to them, the higher the opportunity cost is for engaging in that relationship. So what this chart basically is an increasing amount of time commitment for the relationship, which means an increasing amount of opportunity cost. For men in heterosexual relationships with a evolved male psychology, that opportunity cost of time committed to the partner is going to make a big difference. That is, if you're in a one-night stand with someone, the only thing that you're losing is that one night. And so the bar for who you ought to accept as a member of your one-night stand team of two ought to be fairly low. To go on a date with somebody with the possibility maybe of getting a one-night stand, those criteria ought to also be pretty low, because you're not putting a lot on the table. You're not going to be giving up a lot. Having just a sexual relationship with somebody, still kind of a low opportunity cost. You don't want to slam the door on everybody waiting for someone better to come along. If you have somebody who's not very intelligent, who you wish was more intelligent, but you're still having a one-night stand with them, you're still having a casual date, or you're still having a casual sexual relationship with them, if somebody more desirable, who is more intelligent, who you enjoy more, comes along, you're free to switch to that person at any point, especially if you're male. Now, here's the difference. If you are female, under evolutionary environmental conditions, under ancestral conditions, a one-night stand or a date or a sexual relationship carries with it at least the potential for a very, very large opportunity cost, which we call a pregnancy. If you're a male and you get someone pregnant, the next day you are just as capable of doing whatever you want as you were the day before. If you're a female and your activity results in a pregnancy, you are now, and again, the ancestral environment, committed to 9 months of gestation and probably 3 or 4 years of childcare before you are ready to have another child. So the bar on who ought to be accepted for this activity should be high across the board for women, because their opportunity costs are different in these relationships than they are for men. When you get to marriage, that's when the gaps close, which is this. Men are putting just as much of an opportunity cost on the line. They're forfeiting the ability to move on to a different mate just as much as women are forfeiting their ability to move on to a different mate when they publicly commit to being in a monogamous lifelong relationship. And so that's when preference for intelligence matches up. The thing that really, of course, gets my goat when I read these things is that they have to throw in some plausible escape route for a professor or I guess a student, who doesn't want to buy into an explanation based on biology. And so here's the quote at the end of the explanation for this chart. Critics suggest that these sex differences reflect learned social norms and expected gender-specific behavior. What a bunch of crap. Now, why is that a bunch of crap? It's a bunch of crap mostly because it's not an alternative explanation at all. It doesn't require empirical data to be brought to bear to decide whether this is something that is a product of evolutionary biology and evolved cognitive design, or something that is present in society that can be observed and expected and perhaps even learned. The question, which I want you guys all to keep in mind, whenever anybody says, well, that's just society or that's learned, is why is society like that in the first place, so that it looks like something that was just picked up from society? Where did society get those gender-specific expectations and behaviors? A great explanation for why society happens to have those explanations or has those expectations is because it happens to be a regular feature of our evolved psychology. And once again, just because the last generation was doing it and the current generation does the same thing does not mean that it was copied or learned. It could just be very easily a part of a common design that was passed from generation to generation by virtue of the fact that everybody in both generations and in all the generations that we've been tracking for a couple of thousand years have been human beings. All right, end of rant. The next topic to go after is conformity. Conformity is going to also capture obedience, which makes two huge social psych experiments a part of this section. Conformity is a change in behavior that brings you in line with a group. Now, here's the big thing about conformity. People think of it in a weird way that isn't necessarily very accurate. Judy Harris, who I talk about a lot in my development class, has this quote that said, "Groups don't push, they pull," which is this: a group that is all seemingly on the same page and doing the same thing is going to put a tremendous amount of psychological pressure and force on somebody to also do that thing. The group does not have to threaten you. The group does not have to be explicit about what they're doing. All that has to happen is a person has to come along to a group, see that everybody's doing the same thing, and will feel a compulsion to go along with that group. So group consensus is in and of itself a very powerful force. The little meme down here, peer pressure: if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? I know the answer, and the answer is yes. Okay? People will and have done stupid things that they never thought they were going to do, things that they never thought they were capable of, things that they never would have guessed they would have engaged in, simply by virtue of the fact that a group of people was doing that thing as well. And it sometimes surprises us to the point where we get really freaked out that we never knew ourselves, because we're suddenly a different person around a group of people who seem to be unanimous in doing something that we didn't think we were going to do. All right. Conformity often comes along in the form of social norms. Social norms is this thing that everybody seems to be doing in society, and so it gives you pressure to do that same thing too. Social norms can either be descriptive or injunctive. Descriptive social norms is just if somebody came in and started writing down what people were doing and describing the regularity with which people responded to stimuli, that might be a social norm. Okay, here in the United States, a social norm might be that you leave a certain amount of space between you and the car in front of you when you are driving, or that you go through a yellow light to make a left-hand turn, at least a couple of cars, because the people behind you also want to get going. Okay, at CNU, a social norm is that you hold the door open for somebody when they're approaching the same building that you are. And sometimes it gets ridiculous because when somebody's 50 yards away and you notice they're heading towards your door, you might be standing there for a couple of minutes by the time they get there. But that would be a description. The injunction would be the actual command to do so. There are laws that tell you how closely you are legally allowed to follow behind a car. That would be the injunctive norm. It is somebody saying, do this, being explicit about it.
Only one of the people in the group is a real subject, the fifth person with the white t-shirt.
Then came a small breakthrough. Harris was struggling to show that peer groups exert subtle power over individual members. She decided to re-examine a landmark study on conformity by social psychologist Solomon Asch.
You're to look at the line on the left and determine which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length.
In Asch's 1953 study, 5 accomplices all give what is clearly a wrong answer to a simple visual puzzle.
2. 2.
The subject denies the evidence of his own eyes and yields to group influence.
What Solomon Asch showed was that groups don't push, they pull. The desire to conform comes from the person, not necessarily from pressure of the group. It's a very strong desire, and it's one that people are not aware of until they find themselves at odds with their group. And then they find themselves in distress. Why are they thinking that while I'm thinking this? What's wrong with me?
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. This man has apparently been in groups before.
People are designed to identify with a group and to conform in some way to that group. It's not something that children really have to learn. It's how they're built.
It was the Asch line study, a famous study done by Solomon Asch, who was interested in conformity. This is one of those studies where the results surprised people so much that they really got into it, and they kind of objected, but they eventually had to realize that we as people, as Americans, as individuals, we're not really as in control of ourselves as we tend to think we are. The person right here in the study is the person in these pictures who is not in on the group, who is not in on the study, who is listening to other people in the group say that the longest line is not the longest line. And the behavior of people who are in that seat is something that is sometimes overblown when this study is discussed in introductory psych classes. It was only 1 out of 20 people, 5%, who went along with the group every time they were asked to make an absurd judgment, okay? So only 5% were just absolutely on board with the group all the time. 25%, 1 out of 4 people in the Solomon Asch line study just looked at these people and they're like, you guys are crazy, and never actually went along with them, never conformed. And the other thing is, among those people who had a mix of sometimes they agree and sometimes they didn't, most of the time, 2/3 of the time, people bucked the group and said, the longest line is the longest line. But that meant that about 60%, 70% of the people did at least once ignore the evidence of their own eyes and publicly state that they were going to choose one of the shorter lines as the longest lines. Now, why was this? Well, there's a couple of different ways that you can talk about the influence of a group. Informational influence and normative influence. Either the group was giving you information that you thought you might have lacked, or the group is basically establishing a norm that you had a hard time bucking. The conformity in this study, by the way, turned out to be something that the people in the study didn't actually believe. It was public conformity. So the people in the Solomon Asch line studies were sitting there looking at the paper, knowing that the longest line was in fact the longest line, but stating that it wasn't because the norm is so strong. But it isn't as if their eyes betrayed them. They tricked themselves into thinking that the lines were of weird and different lengths. They privately knew that they were saying something that wasn't true, but they nevertheless publicly stated that it was in order to get along. So public conformity is what we see here in this clip from Shaun of the Dead, where in order to get to the goal that the people have, they, for a period of time, take on the ways of moving and acting that the zombies are already have. They're conforming with the motion of the zombie horde in order to get through. Now, the opposite of, or the other side of the coin of public conformity is private acceptance. If you take on the group's consensus or the group's norm and you actually make it a part of your own belief so that you accept what they say and you actually privately believe it, then you're doing something a little bit different. Everyone seems to hate Nickelback, which is kind of weird, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of kind of blah rock bands out there, but Nickelback fills stadiums. They sell huge numbers of albums. They've done very, very well, and there's nothing particularly objectionable to the people or to the music. So what is it about everybody and Nickelback that makes them say from the bottom of their soul that, yeah, they suck? It's an interesting phenomenon. It has a lot to do with both conformity and repeated exposure, because in the clip that I'm about to show you, Brian Posehn in the 90s was doing a promo spot for a show called Tough Crowd with Colin Quinn. Colin Quinn was the host. And they showed this promo, they showed this bump like 3 times per commercial break while we're all trying to watch South Park. Okay. And so people heard this joke about Nickelback again and again and again and again and again for like weeks and months, to the point where it kind of seeped into the culture so thoroughly that people started saying it was okay to talk trash about Nickelback. It was just what everybody was believing. But anyway, I've got the clip here. Let me show you.
No one talks about the studies that show that bad music makes people violent. Like Nickelback makes me want to kill Nickelback.
Right? So there we go. All right. Conformity. When does conformity actually happen? When is it strongest? When does it take place? Well, a couple of things influence how likely people are to conform in a particular situation. First, if the judgment is at least somewhat ambiguous, people can find permission to conform because the pressure to conform might be strong. But if it's clearly absurd what they're being asked to accept, that can be a roadblock. But if it's at least a little bit ambiguous and it's hazy and there's evidence on either side and you could really see, well, it becomes much easier to give yourself permission to go along with the group. Unanimity of everybody else in the group is also a huge factor. If everybody that you're discussing a topic with is unanimous in their position, and you're the only one who doesn't seem to agree, then it becomes much more difficult to stand your ground. Which is why every once in a while when I'm on Facebook and I don't necessarily want to start an argument, I don't think that I'm going to change anybody's mind, I will nevertheless just drop into the comments, say, hi, how's it going? Just want to drop in and say, I disagree. I don't think this is right. I'm out. I'm not really trying to change the poster's mind. I'm not ready for an argument, but I just want to plant a flag for anybody else who reads those comments, that if they don't agree with what was posted, that they are not alone and they can stick to their guns because somebody else is with them, and it happens to be me. It's a very quick non-anxiety provoking online interaction, which is kind of what I'm after right now. In the Solomon Asch study, compliance or conformity with the group dropped precipitously if at least one other person modeled or was willing to give the right answer, even if everybody else in the group was giving the wrong answer. The size of the majority also matters. If you're in a room with 2 or 3 people, maybe it's not so forceful, but if you're in a room with 15 people, it becomes much more difficult to face that kind of unanimity. And another factor the book talks about is called minority influence. There's a whole bigger literature on minority influence that would even let people understand what it means. But minority influence is more of a process than a factor. If you are a member of a cohesive and fairly well-defined minority within a group where you can identify with each other and you say, because we are similar in this way, we know that we disagree with the majority and we're going to stand our ground because we are well-defined, we know who we are. That kind of persistence from a minority can actually prevent unanimity, for one, but it can start to convince or bring in people from the majority when they start assessing the 2 different, what are now coalitions. If their majority coalition doesn't really seem to have a good argument, but everybody's really sticking to their guns over here in the minority, people might start to shift to the point where the minority becomes the majority. That's been a little bit of a while. We've got another darker thing to discuss here in the second half. But in the meantime, I'm going to give you what is already a pretty dark sketch from The Kids in the Hall, a classic Canadian comedy group with stars that were still somewhat around. You might recognize Dave Foley down here, Scott Thompson, and a couple of things. But this is the Citizen Kane sketch from Kids in the Hall.
Good movie. It wasn't a great movie, but how often do you see a great movie?
Oh, I saw a great movie last night. Yeah, it was on the Late Show. It was what was it called? It's a classic. It's a classic. It's oh, I hate this. I hate it when this happens.
Well, what was it about?
It's about this newspaper tycoon, and he's dead, and everybody's telling stories about him, and
it's Citizen Kane.
No, that's not it. No, but it's something like that. It's
okay, who was in it?
Orson Welles is in it.
Oh.
And it's
this is
called...
Citizen Kane. It's Citizen Kane.
No, that isn't it. That isn't it. But it's you're not far from it. It's
well, who else was in it?
I don't know.
Was Joseph Cotton in it?
What else has he been in?
The Third Man, The Magnificent Ambersons.
Oh, The Magnificent Ambersons. Yes, he was in it. Yes. Oh, that's one of my favorite Orson Welles movies.
Well, this is definitely Citizen Kane. Then you're talking about Citizen Kane.
No, but it's something like that. It's
Right,
Psy.
No, not Psy. Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane.
Psycho.
No.
It's Psycho.
No, it isn't Psycho.
It's Psycho.
No, it is Psycho. Is this about a motel owner who's crazy and kills a woman in a shower?
No, I just told you. It's about this newspaper tycoon. He had a sled named Rosebud, and they're all trying
then
to
I guess it wasn't Psycho, was it?
No, it wasn't Psycho.
It was Citizen Kane.
No, it was Angels. The Trouble with Angels.
No, it wasn't The Trouble with Angels, no. That's a Haley Mills vehicle. That's not even close.
The Front Page.
Oh, The Front Page is a comedy. Did you laugh once?
No.
Then I guess it wasn't The Front Page, was it?
Well, what the hell was it then?
Look, that guy has a newspaper. I'm going to borrow. Read the TV listings, and we'll settle this once.
Oh, no, don't. I really want to remember this myself.
Please,
I want to get it myself.
Please,
I want to remember this myself. Please.
Just sit down.
Oh, great. That's really going to help me to think. That's great. You know what? I almost had it. But now, thanks to you, I've gone blank.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
what time was it on last
night? It's 11:30. We don't need the papers. The paper chase.
Okay, what channel was it on?
Paper was Channel 3. Paper.
Look! Citizen Kane! It was Citizen Kane! It was Citizen Kane! It was Citizen Kane!
Okay, big deal. Look, would you just take the knife out, huh? Just take the knife out.
You admit you're wrong, and I'll take the knife out.
Oh, come on, grow up. Take the knife out.
Oh, no. You never admit you're wrong. When you admit you're wrong, I'll grow up.
You're being very mature now. Would you please take the knife out?
When do you admit you're wrong? You never admit you're wrong.
Look, you're making a fool of yourself in front of everyone, all right? Would you just please take the knife out? Take the damn knife out. Oh, jeez. Listen, look, would you mind just calling me a, oh, what are they called?
An ambulance?
No, I want
Do you want two guys in the van to come and take care of your hand and bring you to a hospital?
Yes, exactly, yes.
Then you want an
No, I
ambulance.
don't. I want a,
It's an ambulance.
No, it isn't. I want a, no, it's a
It's an ambulance. You want an ambulance.
All right. You might have been waiting for this one. This is the obedience part of the section of the compliance section of the chapter. Obedience was something that was very fascinating to people after we were coming to grips with humanity after World War II. World War II seemed to have exposed the utter depravity that people were capable of, and the hatred, even self-destructive driving hatred that people would have towards other groups. And again, Americans who might not have thought that they would have publicly said that a short line is long in the Asch study, certainly didn't think that they would hurt another person under the instructions of an authority figure. What Americans told themselves after World War II was over was that the actions of Nazi Germany, or even the actions of Stalinist Russia, a little bit later, were a character flaw of the people in that nation. That there was something about Germans that made them susceptible to group hatred and being controlled by a strongman. Milgram came along and said, you know what, I would like to go ahead and test that theory because it's an idea and I like to test things, and set up this study, famous study, with very disturbing results.
That is incorrect.
The ultimate conformity.
195 votes.
Total blind obedience to a leader was elicited in a controversial laboratory experiment by this researcher, Stanley Milgram, a former student of Solomon Asch. Milgram wondered whether the evil deeds of the Nazis were the result of their personal defects, or whether anyone has the capacity for evil if the situation is powerful enough. In 1961, when Hitler's henchman Adolf Eichmann was standing trial for war crimes, Milgram wanted to find out how far ordinary people would go in obeying orders. Would they, like Eichmann, execute strangers if they were told to? In Milgram's experiment, a subject was paid to participate in what he thought was a study of memory. He was asked to play the role of teacher, helping someone improve his memory.
You want to step right in here, learner, and have a seat there. You can leave your coat on the back of that chair if you will, please. Take it right off.
Guiding the subject was the experimenter in the lab coat, who acted as the legitimate authority in the situation.
Right up to the counter.
Both the experimenter and the man being tested as the learner were part of Milgram's team. And how was the subject supposed to help the learner improve his memory? By delivering electric shocks as punishment for every mistake.
This machine generates electric shocks, and when you press one of the switches all the way down, the learner gets a shock.
The shocks began as mild, but they had to be increased with each era until they were potentially lethal. Although no shocks were actually given, the teacher subject was made to think he was punishing the learner.
Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me.
Go on.
Out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich boy.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here.
The next phrase is fast.
Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me
Bird,
out.
car, train, plane.
Continue, teacher.
What would you do in this situation? Would you continue?
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast bird. The next one, blunt.
At the time, 40 experts were asked to predict the performance of the subjects. They estimated that most would not go beyond 150 volts, and only 1 in 1,000, the sadists, would go all the way to 450 volts. In fact, 2/3 of the subjects went all the way. While many of them objected, the majority did not disobey.
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
I asked Stanley Milgram how many of the subjects who quit the experiment ever got up to help the learner without first getting the experimenter's permission. He said, not one, not ever. So blind obedience is not limited to the fascist mentality. It's part of the basic human condition, brought out by situational forces. Hundreds and hundreds of subjects obeyed the experimenter, men and women, young and old.
Nobody liked Milgram after that. Milgram actually kicked off a real interest in making sure that human participants were protected. And that was probably a good thing. Milgram's experiments would not have met ethical standards today, but it is kind of funny how a lot of people have been doing a lot of things to participants that weren't very ethical. But when Milgram came around and really told us something we didn't want to know about ourselves and really stuck a finger in the eye of the psychological establishment, that they started really working hard to make sure that such a study couldn't be carried out again. Why did Milgram make everybody mad? Well, before he actually ran the study, he consulted with a whole bunch of very knowledgeable, very proud of their knowledge, psychologists and sociologists who said that in the scenario that he described, where you started off with mild shocks and you went so far as to have triple X danger, deadly switch that is probably going to kill the person in the next room, 2% was the prediction about how many people would go through with that study. The true psychopaths. People who were just looking for the opportunity to kill somebody with shock, and boy, they were going to take it because this was their day. In the end, it wasn't 2% of people who did it. It was the majority. It was 65% of people in that study went all the way to the end when they were under the suggestion, not the threat, not necessarily even the order, but the request of an experimenter to go through with the study. The experimenter never said, you'll lose your money. The experimenter never said, we'll turn you in. The experimenter never said, I will hurt you or harm you or embarrass you in any way. The experimenter just said, the experiment must continue, please continue. And that was all. The experimenter, as long as they were, by the way, willing to take responsibility, that would seem to be a big one, then the participant seemed to just go ahead most of the time. Now, there were a couple of things that Milgram was able to do to lessen the degree to which people had a tendency to conform. If the status of the experimenter was somewhat lessened, like they weren't at Yale, but they were in kind of a grimy rental place out somewhere else in the city, compliance kind of dropped because people didn't have the same kind of authority or clout when they were giving suggestions. If you put somebody in the room with another person who was modeling nonconformity to the request to shock somebody, then people had a tendency to not comply at nearly the same rates. You know, if somebody else was willing to stand up, they were willing to stand up with them because they had a partner, just like the conformity studies. If somebody else was giving the right answer, people were willing to give the right answer too, because at least they had a buddy. But it was nevertheless disturbing because Americans and good people everywhere like to tell themselves that if they were Nazi Germany, they would be this guy, the only one in the picture who is not giving the Nazi salute. A hero, a resistor, and it turns out that we're not. It turns out that that is not a common aspect of Americans. It's not a common aspect of human beings at all. For whatever reason, either public conformity or privately being convinced, people will go along with group activity and will not find that courage that we all think we have to, in the moment, step up and be that guy who says, no, I won't, and has courage. Again, we all like to say that we would, and Americans especially like to think that we would stand on our own to do what's right. But it turns out that in the Milgram study, we don't. We didn't. And that really made people think, are we just, except for the luck of history, Nazis? And Milgram's study said, yeah, basically, if you had found yourself in 1930s Germany, you would have acted just like the German citizenry did. They're not different from you. You're just in a different circumstance. And people were like, well, you know what? That was a long time ago. The 50s was a different era. Everybody was a little bit more buttoned up and nationalistic, and they listened to authority. Now we're more individualistic. We've gotten more empathic. We've gotten, I don't want to say softer. What do you? And we wouldn't really be like that now. So that's why in 2009, another researcher decided to see if we were still the same kind of people. Jerry Berger at Santa Clara University in Southern California here, okay? Not like authoritarian central, not Nazi-ish kind of people in terms of their own identity, okay? Were the participants in a study that replicated the exact same setup that Milgram had. Now, here's the difference. In order to get it by the committee that was in charge of making sure that people were psychologically and physically safe, what Berger realized in looking over the Milgram data was that if anybody was going to actually refuse to comply with all the way to the end triple X shocks, they did so at 150 volts. And 150 volts is the point at which the person being shocked, the fake person being shocked, and they were never actually shocked, but the message that was coming in from the quote learner in the study was that they were asking to be let go. Let me go, let me out of here, this hurts, I want to be done with the study, I want to be done with the study. If anybody was going to stop, they were going to have stopped by that point. And so in the Berger study, they only ran the experiment up until that point. And if anybody went past 150 volts, they didn't put them through the rest of the person having a heart attack in the booth, the person passing out in the booth, not being responsive at all, and still being asked to shock them when they're already unconscious. They just went to the relatively mildly traumatic 150 volts and then called it quits there and then explained the study, okay? What happened? Well, it turns out that in the Milgram study, in like the original Milgram study that was as similar as possible to the one that was done at Santa Clara, 33 out of 40 people reached that 150 volt mark and went ahead. 28 out of the 40 people at Santa Clara did the same. That is not a significant difference when you're dealing with a sample size of 40 people, okay? So you couldn't even really say that the people in Southern California were even reliably at all less likely to deliver deadly shocks to somebody in 2009 than a person in New Haven, Connecticut was in 1955. We still seem to be the same people. We still seem to be the same kind of people. This mechanism in our brain still seems to be functioning, and it still seems to be motivating us to make excuses for ourselves, to twist the way that we see the world in order to come into compliance with a group, because we are either just programmed that way for reasons that we don't understand, or very fearful of being out of step with a bunch of people who are marching in the same direction. I will have more hopeful information to share with you when we get back together on Friday for our very last lecture. But I hope that you enjoyed this one today. Have a good rest of the week, and I will see you back here again on Friday.